The night was never silent. Even before words, the savannas of Africa pulsed with sound, the rasp of insects, the low thunder of distant storms, the cough of lions echoing across dry valleys. And within that living orchestra, small bands of early hominins moved, fragile against the backdrop of predators. They had no words, not yet. Their throats could produce cries, sharp bursts of alarm, guttural barks when food was stolen, high-pitched wails when an infant was dragged away by the night. These sounds were raw, urgent, carved directly from fear and need. They carried meaning, but no structure. Yet in those cries, in the flicker of eyes and the rise of hands, lay the first fragile seeds of language. They gestured more than they spoke. A lifted hand could freeze a group in place. A tilted chin could point toward hidden fruit. A stare wide with fear could halt a child before it wandered into the grass. Their eyes were more eloquent than their mouths. The set of a jaw, the curl of fingers, the rhythm of a body in motion, all of these were sentences. For them, the body was grammar, the face was script, and silence was as powerful as a shout. Survival demanded this silent speech. A solitary being could not endure the world of saber-toothed cats, massive hyenas, and crocodiles that lurked in rivers. To live was to belong to the group, and to belong meant understanding signals. The oldest form of communication was not sound at all but attention. To look where another looked, to mirror their tension or calm, this was the first conversation. The ancestors learned to share focus, eyes widening toward rustling grass, bodies shifting together, breaths held in unison. In that shared attention was the root of every story humanity would one day tell. Picture the plains, endless horizons of gold and shadow. A band of Australopithecines moves through the grass, upright but small, wary of every sound. One halts suddenly, raising an arm. The rest freeze. Silence spreads like lightning. A leopard crouches low in the grass. They retreat, not chaotically, but as one body. No words are spoken, yet a decision has been made. Fire was not yet theirs to master, but they carried sparks within, instincts pressing toward communication. When storms struck trees and flames spread, they gathered near the glow, frightened yet entranced. Shadows danced across their faces, and in the rhythm of flickering light, their gestures gained new force. Pointing hands, trembling fingers, glances that spoke of awe and terror. The fire was teacher as well as danger. It gathered them, it gave them a stage for their first unspoken myths. Fear of the dark, reverence for the blaze. The mother was language's first architect. Her gaze soothed an infant, her touch calmed panic. The rhythm of heartbeat against skin was the first dialogue of comfort. When danger came, her sharp hiss or bark of sound froze her children before claws could reach them. Every act of care was also an act of teaching. To listen, to notice, to understand that sounds and gestures held meaning beyond themselves. In those small exchanges, across thousands of generations, the first fragile chords of language were spun. The mornings of that ancient world always began with hunger. Before words, before stories, before promises or memory, there was only the persistent ache of survival. The sun rose over a vast plain of swaying grasses, turning them to gold as its light crept slowly across the land. In those grasses lurked predators, their bodies low and patient, their eyes burning like hidden embers, and in the middle of it all, a scattered group of early hominins stirred, rising on two legs, fragile yet unyielding. They had no language to greet the day, but they moved together with a rhythm that held them close. They touched each other, they brushed dust from shoulders, they pulled the young upright by their tiny arms. These actions, silent and unremarkable, were their greetings. A mother lifted her child, and the child responded with a soft chirp. A male stretched his arms wide and began to walk, and the others followed in his wake. The group moved as a single organism, each action mirrored and repeated, until a pattern emerged. That pattern was communication. It was a sentence written in bodies rather than words, an unspoken promise. I follow, I belong, I understand. Cries and calls filled their world, though none were yet words. Their throats could summon sharp barks that cut the air when danger approached. They could moan in grief when a companion died. They could shriek in alarm when a shadow fell suddenly across the ground. These sounds were raw, tied tightly to the moment. bound by circumstance, yet within them lay the faint beginning of structure. A high-pitched cry meant the danger above, eagles circling. A deep guttural rumble meant the danger in the grass, a lion stalking. Over time, each generation leaned more heavily upon these cries, each cry pulling closer to the edge of meaning. Mothers shaped these sounds as they comforted infants, humming low and soft to calm their restlessness. Hunters sharpened them into harsh calls that rallied companions when predators threatened their kill. Each utterance was still tied to the moment, but it stretched, little by little, toward intention. Still, it was the hand that carried the truest grammar. The hand could point, it could beckon, it could warn. A palm raised stopped the group in its tracks. A quick flick of fingers sent them fanning left or right. But gestures grew beyond utility. A narrowing of the eyes became suspicion. A tilt of the head became a question. An open hand held forward became peace. Without knowing it, they were weaving rules, rules that governed expectation and response. It was grammar before grammar, syntax before speech, the invisible contract that said, "Watch me and you will understand, listen, and you will live." The first conversations were woven from silence and rhythm, not sound. Imagine the hunt. The group spreads across the plain, bodies low, each watching the other. One halts, arm lifted, all freeze. A flick of his hand sends them forward, and they surge together in coordinated bursts. Their prey bolts, but is caught between them. A cry bursts from their throats, not words but triumph, their bodies stomping, their chests pounding. Victory is shared in sound and motion, in the ritual of joy. That ritual is as much a sentence as any word that would come millennia later. At night, when shadows grew long and the air turned cold, they gathered tightly. The darkness pressed on them, filled with unseen threats, and fear tightened their throats. Some whimpered, some rocked, but others reached out, a hand on a shoulder, a gentle hum that rose and fell like breath. A body swayed, and another mirrored it, until the whole group rocked in unison. These simple rituals calmed their terror, bound them into something larger than themselves. In the repetition of sound and motion lay the roots of culture, of belonging, of something that would one day grow into myth. They had no words, but they had ritual, and ritual was enough to hold back the night. The children learned without being taught. They watched their mothers' faces, the way their brows lifted, the way lips curved or tightened. They imitated. They pointed at the fruit dangling above and chirped, and the mother answered with a glance or a touch, and understanding passed between them. In these small lessons, over thousands upon thousands of dawns, language was being born, not in the sudden strike of invention, but in the long weaving of lives lived close, in fear and hunger, and the need to belong. Long before words, meaning had already found its way into the world. It lived in the rhythm of breath, in the glance that froze a child, in the gesture that guided a hunt. It lived in silence, in ritual, in cries that pierced the dark. And though no one knew it, those fragile chords of meaning were strong enough to carry them across the ages, toward the first true spark of speech. The first flames were never theirs. They did not create fire, they discovered it, trembling in awe and fear when lightning struck a tree, or when the savannah burned under the dry breath of the wind. But once they saw it, they could not look away. Fire became the great teacher of silence and sound, the mirror in which their own voices began to take shape. At first they circled it from a distance, eyes wide, shoulders hunched. The blaze crackled and roared like an animal, yet it did not move to strike. It devoured wood, but it gave light, and in that light their faces glowed red and gold. They gathered closer, inch by inch, until they felt its warmth. And when the night pressed close, when predators lingered just beyond the circle of sparks, they found themselves safe. Around that safety, communication deepened. Shadows thrown by fire became part of their language. A hand raised against the glow cast long gestures on the earth, visible to all. Eyes reflected flame, widening in fear or narrowing in wonder, and the group responded to those cues without hesitation. Fire gave them not only warmth, but focus. It bound their attention together, turning scattered glances into shared meaning. They could not keep fire yet. When it died, they lost it, and waited for the sky to gift it again. But while it lived, they learned. They learned to sit in circles, to face one another, to share the same center of attention. In that circle, the first stories were born not in words, but in rhythm, in pantomime, in cries that rose and fell like song. A hunter acted out the strike of a predator, the leap of an antelope, the narrow escape. His body moved in the glow, and the group gasped or laughed or wailed in chorus. This was not yet speech, but it was narration. It was memory turned outward. Children imitated the performances. They crouched low, sprang into the air, bared their teeth, and the others understood. Each gesture, each sound was no longer tied only to the moment. It pointed to something beyond the present, something remembered or imagined. That leap was not only a leap now, but the leap that was. In that widening of meaning lay the seed of symbolic thought. Time and again, they returned to fire when the sky gave it. With each return, the performances grew more complex. Grunts and cries acquired rhythm. Hands beat against chests or thighs to mark emphasis. Voices rose and fell together in unison, a proto-song that echoed across the plain. The group swayed, rocked, and learned the music of belonging. And fire did more than gather them. It revealed the night. Beyond the circle of light, predators' eyes gleamed. The group saw them, and their cries became warnings, their gestures urgent. In that constant tension between the seen and the unseen, their communication sharpened. A hiss meant silence, a sharp click of tongue meant danger, a low hum meant calm. Over time, those sounds began to carry weight, even away from fire. They became habits of expression, tools of cohesion. Memory began to grow teeth. What was acted out one night could be repeated the next. Gestures became rituals. Rituals became expectations. When a member of the group died, they gathered, rocked and wailed together, not just in grief but in pattern. That pattern was a proto-language of mourning, shared across generations. It said, "We remember, we feel this together, we belong to one another." Mothers, as always, were the carriers of these patterns. They comforted with repetitive hums, rocked with rhythm, touched and stroked in deliberate ways. Infants learned that sound could soothe, that motion could promise safety. Those lessons sank deep, carried forward into adulthood, repeated in every hunt, every gathering. Thus fire, memory, and ritual braided together into something larger. The group began to live not only in the present moment, but in echoes of the past. They remembered hunts, dangers, joys. They carried those echoes with them, shaping cries and gestures, until they pointed beyond the now. The leap from immediacy to memory was the leap from signal to symbol. And though they did not yet know it, that leap had already begun to change everything. The long journey toward language was still only beginning. They had no words to bind together their thoughts, yet already the future was written in their gestures, their cries, their rituals. The savannah pressed hard against their lives, demanding cooperation at every turn. Alone, they were fragile prey. Together, they became something greater, and communication was the invisible thread that wove them into a single fabric. Predators forced their voices to sharpen. When the grass swayed with hidden danger, their cries split into distinct sounds, each carrying a different urgency. The cry for eagle was not the cry for leopard. The bark of alarm was not the same as the whimper of pain. Infants learned the difference before they learned to walk. In this way, the first fragments of vocabulary were carved by fear itself. Hunger taught them rhythm. When they hunted, when they scavenged, when they stripped meat from a kill, they did so with coordinated motion. Sounds became signals became habits. The thud of a hand against a thigh meant move. The sudden intake of breath meant stop. Over generations, these habits hardened into rules. They were not yet words, but they were the bones of words, waiting to be clothed in flesh. And fire, always fire, returned again and again. Each time lightning split the sky and the world burned, they gathered the gift, circled it, and learned anew. The fire taught them to sit in a ring, to face one another, to share. In the light of flames they discovered that the body could perform memory, that sound could echo the past. The hunts were acted out, the dangers mimed, the victories replayed until they became tradition. That tradition became culture, though no one yet knew the name of such a thing. Through these circles of fire, through cries, through gestures, Through rituals of grief and triumph, something invisible yet immense began to grow, a shared mind. Language did not appear suddenly, as lightning strikes from heaven. It grew slowly, as grass grows, as rivers carve valleys, as fire eats wood. It was born in the endless repetition of survival. Every gesture taught, every cry imitated, every ritual remembered. For millions of years, this was the world, silence heavy with meaning, cries sharp with intent, gestures thick with grammar. There were no words, yet there was already conversation. The ancestors lived in that space between animal and human, between cry and speech, and though they could not know it, they were carrying forward the spark that would one day ignite into full language. The night closed again over the plain. Stars wheeled, lions coughed in the dark, hyenas lurked beyond the circle of fire. The group huddled together, swaying, humming, rocking as one. No words passed between them, but they understood. In that understanding, in that silence alive with meaning, the future of humanity waited, patient as the stars. The plains had not changed, yet the beings who crossed them had, taller now, stronger, with bodies built for distance. These early humans walked with a stride more confident than their ancestors. They were Homo erectus, wanderers of savannas and forests, creatures who carried within them a spark greater than fire itself, the growing capacity for speech. They did not yet possess language as we know it, but their throats, lungs, and mouths had begun to change. The shape of their windpipes, the depth of their breath, the flexibility of their tongues, all were slowly adapting. Each cry was sharper, each call more precise. Where once a scream was only alarm, now it could vary. A short cry to summon, a long one to warn, a complex one to rally. The sounds grew richer, and with them, so too did meaning. The dawns of their world broke with voices. As groups stirred from slumber, males let out low grunts that carried across the camp, not only rousing the others, but calling them together. Females answered with sharper tones that gathered children, humming low to calm, or scolding sharply to discipline. Children imitated, their voices breaking into playful bursts that echoed patterns of the adults. Already, the raw clay of sound was being molded into something finer, but it was fire again, always fire that pushed their communication forward. By now they no longer waited only for lightning to strike. They had learned to guard embers, to carry them, to feed them with dry grass and wood. Fire was theirs. It followed them into the dark. It became not only warmth and safety, but the stage upon which their voices evolved. Around the blaze, faces glowed, hands gestured in rhythm with calls, voices rose and fell with the crackle of flames. A hunter acted out the day's pursuit, the crouch, the leap, the strike. His companions responded with cries that imitated his movements, repeating them in chorus. A low chant followed, bodies rocking together, their tones converging into a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat. In those circles, cries became songs, gestures became memory, memory became performance. The night no longer belonged to predators alone. Within the circle of firelight, it belonged to humans, creatures who now carried not only spears but the power of shared sound, and with sound came something new, imagination. They began to vocalize not just to signal the present, but to recall the past. A rising tone could replay the panic of a chase. A trembling moan could evoke the fear of almost being taken by a lion. These sounds, woven with gesture, became the first stories. They were not words, not yet, but they were memory carried in rhythm, emotion carried in tone. Each telling grew longer. Children sat wide-eyed as hunters reenacted dangers. Mothers added soothing notes, reshaping fear into reassurance. The group, drawn tight around fire, leaned forward, listening not to words but to meaning. In that leaning forward lay the birth of narrative. The savannah at night trembled with predators, but within the circle of flame, a new power had awakened. Fire gave them warmth, voices gave them future. They were no longer only surviving, they were beginning at last to speak. Humming, rocking as one. No words passed between them, but they understood. In that understanding, in that silence alive with meaning, the future of humanity waited, patient as the stars. They rose with the dawn, fire still smoldering behind them. its smoke curling into the sky as the sun painted the plain in pale gold. Hunger pulled them forward, always hunger, but now they carried with them not only tools of stone and wood, but voices that stretched further than before. Their sounds no longer scattered like meaningless noise. They clung to shapes, to variations, to the beginnings of pattern. Across the savannah, calls echoed. One figure broke from the group, striding toward a grove of trees. His voice carried back, a sharp cry rising at the end. Others paused, listening. It was not merely alarm, but direction. They followed, drawn not only by the sound but by its shape, its intention. Something in that cry told them where to look, how to respond. Children learned these sounds quickly. They played with them, mimicked them, bent them. Their laughter rang out in high bursts, mimicking the deep tones of their elders. In their play, they discovered new ways of shaping breath, new rhythms, new tones. Language, though unborn, was gestating in their games. Gestures still ruled the day. A hand swept wide to signal abundance. A finger jabbed sharp to warn of danger. But the hand was now joined by voice, and together they formed a duet. Gesture anchored meaning, sound amplified it. When both converged, the message became impossible to mistake. Around the fire at night, their gatherings grew more complex. Hunters returned from long treks and mimed the chase, their bodies crouched and springing. But now sounds poured forth, short barks for each step, a rolling growl for the lion that stalked them, a piercing shriek for the moment of escape. The group leaned forward, drawn not only by movement, but by the growing music of storytelling. In their throats, rhythm and memory fused. Ritual began to root itself in these gatherings. The same cries, the same gestures, repeated night after night, turned performance into tradition. A low chant, once a spontaneous growl of victory, became expected after every successful hunt. A certain cry, once tied to panic, became the ritual call before setting out into the plains. Slowly, sound was pulling free of its tether to the immediate moment. It was beginning to live in the shared imagination. Firelight revealed faces more expressive than ever, brows lifted, lips curled, cheeks pulled tight in grimaces that carried as much meaning as the cries themselves. The group learned to read these signals as easily as they read the grass for hidden predators. One look could warn, one tilt of the mouth could reassure, one widening of the eyes could command stillness. Expression was speech before speech, and it thickened with every generation. They wandered far, these new humans. Homo erectus spread across continents, carrying embers of fire and embers of sound. From Africa to distant lands, their cries and gestures traveled with them. Though their words had not yet arrived, their capacity to shape meaning was no longer bound to chance. It was now a tool, as vital as stone and wood, as necessary as fire. And in the long nights when the flames burned low and stars wheeled overhead, they discovered something else, the pleasure of sound itself. Not only warning, not only memory, pleasure. They repeated cries in rhythm, chanted until their voices cracked, hummed soft patterns into the ears of children, until their eyes closed. They had found not just survival in sound but beauty. It was here in this beauty that the true dawn of language began to rise. The fire had become the heartbeat of their nights. Where once they had feared it, now it was the axis around which their lives revolved. The circle of flame was more than warmth, more than safety. It was the place where voices grew bold, where gestures thickened into ritual, and where the first true threads of culture were spun. As the flames leapt, so too did their sounds. At first, cries were only cries, warnings, alarms, instinct-given breath. But now, in the glow, their tones began to shift into something else. Calls became chants, grunts became refrains. The group discovered rhythm, not only in the stomp of feet or the clap of hands, but in the rise and fall of their voices. They repeated sounds not only to signal but to savor. A syllable-shaped call, once tied to urgency, was spoken again in joy, in play, in performance. It began to drift free of its original purpose. Children absorbed this most of all. They mimicked their elders' chants, shaping the first crude patterns of vocal play. They invented variations, laughed when their sounds were echoed, and repeated until the repetition itself became ritual. In the mouths of children, sound became experiment, and through their endless trial, language crept closer. Gestures remained vital, but no longer stood alone. A hand pointing toward the trees was paired with a rising cry, so that gesture and sound fused into a unit larger than either. Soon the sound alone could hint at the meaning even without the gesture. The group was learning to let the voice carry more of the burden. This was not yet speech, but it was the scaffolding upon which speech would one day stand. In the firelight, performance grew elaborate. A hunter reenacted the chase of the day, crouching, leaping, thrusting his crude spear, but now his story carried rhythm. In his throat, short bursts for each leap, low rumbles for the moment of hiding, high shrieks for the instant of triumph. The others joined him, echoing sounds in chorus. The event was no longer a memory, it was a performance shared, repeated, carried forward. These performances became the first proto-stories, not narratives in words, but narratives in sound and motion. Meaning extended beyond the immediate. A shriek could recall yesterday's lion, a chant could promise tomorrow's hunt. The group's shared imagination grew, expanding the boundaries of communication. They were not only living in the present, they were beginning to live in time. Grief too found its ritual voice. When one of their own fell to predator or famine, the group did not remain silent. They gathered, swayed, and let low moans rise from their throats, weaving them together until the sound thickened into a chorus. The same sound repeated became tradition. Tradition became expectation. Each death carried its own lament, but the lament was always the same. They had discovered mourning, and in it the recognition that sound could hold meaning larger than one life. Homo erectus spread further, carrying these rituals across plains, forests, and rivers. Embers of fire and embers of voice traveled with them. New lands brought new predators, new dangers, new cries, but the foundation remained. In every circle of flame, rhythm bound them. In every hunt, gesture and voice wove strategy. In every loss, shared lament thickened bonds. The great leap was not yet words, but it was more than cries. It was the birth of symbolic sound, of memory sung aloud, of imagination finding breath. In the darkness of prehistory, the first tongues of fire spoke, and the world began to listen. The night stretched long, but they no longer feared it as they once had. The fire was theirs now, guarded and carried, fed with dry branches, coaxed back to life from embers. Where fire lived, they lived, and where it glowed, their voices grew stronger. The circle of flame was no longer only protection from the dark, it was the cradle of sound. Voices wove together in the glow. They no longer called only for alarm or hunger. They lingered on sounds, stretching them, repeating them, savoring the breath that carried them. They discovered rhythm in their throats, rhythm that matched the crackle of firewood, the sway of bodies, the pounding of feet on the ground. The air itself became instrument, shaped by lungs and tongue and teeth. Children sat closest to the fire, eyes wide, mouths open. They babbled endlessly, trying every shape of sound, laughing when others echoed them. Their play was experiment, and experiment was invention. Out of play came patterns, and out of patterns came the first foundations of speech. Hunts became rehearsals of coordination. Long before they struck, the group gathered and echoed calls: a short sharp cry for now, a low rolling growl for wait, a high piercing shriek for danger. They moved as one body, each sound carrying command. It was not yet language, but it was the embryo of command and obedience, of planning and execution, of minds bound together by breath. Even grief, sharpened by centuries of loss, found voice. Around the fire they swayed, letting deep moans fill the night, each voice folding into the next until the whole group became one sound. The dead were mourned in rhythm, their absence marked in chorus. Death was no longer silent, it was given voice, and in that voice the living found unity, and there was joy. Around the fire they chanted for no reason but the pleasure of it, stamping feet and clapping hands, raising voices in repetition, until sound itself became ecstasy. They had found beauty in noise, and in beauty they found something larger than survival. They found a glimpse of meaning, of culture, of humanity rising from the raw clay of instinct. So they spread across plains, across rivers, across continents, carrying not only fire but the growing seeds of speech. Their voices rang out over new landscapes, different cries for different lands, but the essence remained, sound married to meaning, meaning shared across time. The tongues of fire had spoken, the future waited within them, the long silence of the ancestors had broken, and though words had not yet arrived, the breath of humanity was already filling the world. The world was older now, but so were they, taller, more graceful, minds burning brighter than fire. Homo sapiens had arrived. Their bodies carried not only strength but subtlety, their faces capable of expressions unseen before, their tongues and throats crafted for an infinite range of sound. They were born to speak, though speech itself had only begun to stir within them. The plains were still filled with predators, but sapiens stood differently. They did not only survive, they imagined. Their eyes did not only watch the grass for danger, they looked beyond the horizon into futures that had not yet come. That imagination bled into their cries, shaping them into something richer, more precise, more enduring. In camps scattered beneath acacia trees, voices filled the morning. Not only grunts or barks, but strings of sound, varied and intentional. Mothers called children with rising tones, not only to summon but to soothe. Males summoned one another with sharp syllables that carried distance and urgency. Children mimicked endlessly, their mouths shaping noise into new patterns, laughing when others understood. The play of sound became the work of language, around fire now theirs to master and guard. Performances grew more elaborate, no longer only gestures with sound, but layered sequences of cries and rhythms, repeated night after night until tradition took root. Hunters replayed the chase with both body and voice, cries breaking into patterns that began to resemble words. Companions echoed them, the performance growing until it filled the night. But something new was stirring, something beyond survival or ritual. They began to speak of what was not there. Their gestures pointed not to the prey in front of them, but to the hunt of yesterday, or the imagined hunt of tomorrow. Their cries echoed not only present fear but memory, prediction and desire. This was the leap, the explosion of symbolic thought, when sounds no longer chained themselves to the moment, but broke free into imagination. Symbols spread like wildfire. Marks carved into bones, scratches on stone, pigments smeared on walls. These were not mere decoration but meaning externalized. The handprints pressed against cave walls were more than presence. They were statements. I was here. I am part of this world. I leave a trace for you to find. Their voices swelled to match their symbols. Repetition became structure. Sounds strung together became names, identifiers for people, places, and tools. To name was to summon, to fix meaning into breath. And once something had a name, it could live beyond the moment. A hunter could warn of a lion not seen, or recall the river visited days ago. Words became memory, made air. The world shifted under this new power. Cooperation deepened, plans stretched across days, even seasons. A group could divide, journey, reunite, all held together by the tether of shared words. Knowledge no longer lived only in bodies but in voices that carried it from elder to child, across fires, across generations, and with language came myth. Around fire, stories grew of beasts greater than those they hunted, of spirits in the trees, of ancestors walking in the night sky. The stories bound them together, not only through fear but through wonder. They created order where the world was chaos, meaning where death had been silence. The leap was not only in sound but in thought. Where once they had lived only in the present, they now lived in time, past, present, future, woven into speech. Language had arrived. Humanity had begun to tell its own story. The fire still roared at night, but its meaning had changed. For Homo sapiens, fire was no longer only protection or warmth. It had become the theater of the mind, the forge where stories were hammered into shape. Around its glow, voices lifted and fell in ways no other creature had ever known. The night air itself trembled with invention. They no longer limited themselves to cries of warning or chants of ritual. Their voices stretched into threads of sound, woven together into shapes that could carry memory. A hunter stood and spoke, not acted, not merely mimed, but spoke, and the others understood not just his gestures but his sounds. They leaned forward, drawn into the unfolding of something greater than themselves. Children, restless and wide-eyed, absorbed every flicker of sound. Their mouths stumbled through syllables, bending them, reshaping them, inventing variations. Mothers listened, echoed, and corrected, until the sounds settled into familiar patterns. Patterns became habit. Pattern became structure. Structure hardened into the first languages, fragile, yet astonishing. With language came distance. No longer did meaning depend upon immediate presence. They could speak of rivers not yet reached, of herds far across the plain, of dangers yet unseen. Their words stretched time and space, carrying minds beyond the horizon. Where once a gesture could only point, a word could summon, and words carried more than facts. They carried dreams. Around the fire, one voice spoke of ancestors lingering in the sky, of spirits carved into rock, of shapes that lived in shadows. Another voice answered, adding to the tale. Soon the group swayed to the rhythm of imagination, their stories growing with each telling. The stories were not true, but truth was not the point. They gave order to chaos, comfort to fear, wonder to silence. Symbols deepened this revolution. They mixed earth and ash, smearing colors on walls, tracing the outlines of animals, of hands, of the unseen. The marks were not random. They were words without sound, voices pressed into stone. They spoke across time, across generations, across the abyss of silence. The handprint, pressed in pigment against stone, was a voice saying, I am here, I was here, remember me. It was not speech, but it was language all the same. With words and symbols came power. Elders taught not only by gesture but by story, passing on lessons of hunts and plants, rivers and stars. The young carried knowledge not only in their eyes, but in their tongues, repeating what they had heard, until memory itself was external, shared, communal. Planning deepened. No longer did the group hunt only by instinct. They discussed, divided roles, set times, imagined outcomes. They spoke of tomorrow as if it already existed, and in doing so they pulled the future closer. The world itself seemed to shift beneath this new power. Animals still stalked, storms still broke, death still came, but the humans had something no other being possessed: the ability to shape reality with sound. To name was to control, to speak was to create, to imagine was to transform. The leap had been made. From cries to words, from gestures to grammar, from silence to symbol, Homo sapiens had crossed the threshold. They were no longer creatures of the moment. They were creatures of time, memory, and imagination. And the world would never be the same. They wandered far beyond the valleys where their ancestors had lived, carrying not only fire but words. Each step into new land was accompanied by voices that stretched and shifted, adapting to landscapes, to prey, to memory. Their languages multiplied like rivers branching across the earth, no two groups shaping sound in the same way, yet all bound by the same miracle: speech. Across the savannah, words rippled like birdsong. One band called a river by a guttural tone, another by a sharp rising syllable. Both meant water, both carried survival, but their shapes were different. Diversity blossomed naturally, as voices bent sound to their own rhythms. For the first time in history, humanity did not share a single tongue, but many. Language had fractured into dialects, into seeds of future nations. With this diversity came identity. To speak in one pattern of sound was to belong. It was a badge, an invisible mark that said, you are one of us. And to hear another tongue was to hear difference. Sometimes that difference bred curiosity, trade, even friendship. Sometimes it bred suspicion, fear, and distance. Language united, but it also divided. But whether shared or divided, the power of words deepened. In every camp, knowledge grew thicker. No longer was memory confined to one lifetime. Hunters spoke of herds across the hills, and their children remembered. Elders spoke of stars that marked the season, and their children carried the rhythm of time. Plants were named, rivers mapped in words, journeys imagined long before they were made. Knowledge was no longer fragile, it was resilient, passed from throat to throat, fire to fire, generation to generation. And alongside knowledge came myth. Words shaped stories of creation, of beings greater than any lion or storm. Around the flames, voices rose not only to explain the world, but to enchant it. They spoke of animals as spirits, of rivers as living things, of death as a passage into another realm. Myths bound them together, giving meaning where silence once reigned. Symbols joined words in this work. Pigments deepened into art. Caves blossomed with animals that ran across walls, hands layered upon hands like an eternal chorus. Each mark was more than memory. It was magic, the power to make absence present, to make imagination visible. Language and art walked hand in hand, inseparable, two halves of the same explosion. The leap reshaped the human mind itself. Thought grew more intricate, branching and looping, carried by the scaffolding of words. Where once they had seen only the immediate, now they imagined futures, judged pasts, dreamed possibilities. They argued, persuaded, deceived. They commanded, promised, cursed and blessed. No other creature could do this. No predator, no rival, no ally among animals could bind minds across time. Language had lifted humans out of the eternal present into the boundless ocean of imagination. And though the world around them was still savage, still brutal, they carried within their voices a power greater than claws or tooth, the power to dream together. It was the beginning of everything that would follow. The stars turned slowly overhead, as they had for millions of years, but for the first time in history there were voices below that named them. The night sky was no longer only a ceiling of light. It was a map, a story, a realm of spirits and ancestors. Around their fires, Homo sapiens pointed upward, tracing lines between stars, weaving them into patterns. Constellations were born in those gestures, born in those words, fragile but eternal. The earth too was renamed. Rivers no longer existed, only in memory. They were fixed in speech. Mountains gained identity. Valleys carried stories. Animals wore names that bound them into myth. To name was to claim, to hold, to give meaning beyond mere existence. Words did not only describe the world, they remade it. Language became the thread of society. It bound clans through memory, instructed children in skills they had not yet practiced, carried rules that shaped behavior. Without laws written in stone, words alone created order. Promises, warnings, commands, spoken breath, held the weight of survival. To break a word was to break trust, to fracture the invisible net that held the group together. But words were not only for survival, they were for wonder. At night, when danger was pushed back by the fire, stories took on lives of their own. Tales of animals that spoke, of ancestors who walked the stars, of spirits that lingered in caves and rivers. Children fell asleep to these voices, their minds filling with images they had never seen. Through stories, imagination became inheritance. Symbols joined these stories, pressing deeper into caves, brighter upon wall. Animals ran in ochre and charcoal, hands layered across centuries, abstract marks pulsed with unseen meaning. Each painting was a conversation with the future, a dialogue across time. The cave itself became a book, the walls its pages, the flicker of flame its illumination. And so the great leap unfolded, not in a single night, not in a single voice, but across tens of thousands of years. From scattered cries to structured speech, from gestures to grammar, from silence to myth, language had erupted like fire across the earth. It was the gift that made memory eternal, that carried imagination beyond the horizon, that bound minds together into a single fabric of culture. The world was no less dangerous. Predators still prowled, storms still struck, famine still came, but humans carried within them a new power, greater than fire, sharper than stone. They carried words, and with words they were no longer creatures of the present. They were creatures of time, of memory, of dreams. The leap had been made. Humanity had become human at last.
They moved outward like rivers branching from a single source, carrying with them fire, tools, memory, and words. Across valleys and mountains, through forests and deserts, the voice of humanity fractured and multiplied. Where once the cries of their ancestors had been bound to survival alone, now those cries had been sculpted into true speech, and speech was beginning to take on its own lives. The journey of Homo sapiens into new lands did not only shape their bodies and their tools, it shaped their tongues. In one camp beneath the acacia trees, water was called with a deep, rounded sound, carried in the chest. In another, far to the north, where ice clung to the air, water was a sharper, clipped word, quick as frost. The world itself bent their voices. Mountains made them guttural, valleys gave them echoes,
plains stretched their vowels wide and long. Geography carved the shape of sound just as surely as it carved the paths of rivers. To speak was to belong. A sound tied one to a family. A pattern of rhythm bound one to a people. Children absorbed these rhythms with the same certainty with which they learned to walk. The mouth, the ear, the breath itself became symbols of identity. To open one's lips and be understood was to be recognized as kin. To speak differently was to be other. Around fire, the voices of belonging rose. At dusk, groups gathered, and their languages filled the air. Songs of mourning, chants of triumph, laughter of children repeating words in play. These sounds carried across the savannah like birdsong, each group distinct, each voice a thread in the growing tapestry of humanity. The unity of sound had been broken, but in its place came something richer, diversity. The first dialects were born in these separations. Speech shifted slightly across distance, a sound bent here, a rhythm altered there. What had once been one tongue became two, then many, and though they all carried echoes of the same origin, they no longer fit perfectly together. To cross from one camp to another was to enter a different world of meaning. The discovery of difference was sharp. A traveler might approach with open palms, but when he spoke, his sounds struck like strangeness. His words were unknown, his meanings obscured. Suspicion stirred quickly in such moments. A voice could comfort or divide, unite or estrange. The very gift that bound one group together marked the boundary with another, and yet within each group, the bond was absolute. Language gave them continuity, made the child's voice echo the elders, stretched the memory of ancestors into the present. Around every fire, stories were told and retold, each group shaping them with their own words. What was said in one valley was not what was said in the next. Truth itself bent to the rhythm of tongues. Humanity was becoming not only one species but many voices, and those voices, fragile and fleeting though they seemed, would carry farther than footsteps, lasting longer than the fires that burned into the night. At the edges of territories, voices collided. A band crossing a valley would stumble upon another fire glowing in the distance, another circle of figures whose faces mirrored their own, but whose words were strange, carried on unfamiliar rhythms. Curiosity and caution mingled in these moments. The strangers looked alike, their hands held tools of similar stone, their fires burned the same wood, but their sounds fell foreign on the ear. At first, gestures did the work. Open palms to signal peace, shared meat placed on the ground, eyes held long enough to calm suspicion, but soon sounds followed, tentative, halting. One group named water with their word, the others repeated it, stumbling but learning. In return, they offered their own word, their own sound. Little by little, meanings passed between them. Sometimes trade was born this way. Skins moved from one hand to another. A bundle of roots or herbs was exchanged for obsidian or shells. The exchange was not only of goods but of language. A sound for a plant crossed into a new tongue. A word for a tool echoed in another camp. Slowly, imperceptibly, languages began to borrow from one another. None lived in isolation. They were porous, open to influence, carrying pieces of neighbors like seeds carried by wind. But not all meetings ended in peace. There were nights when strange voices rang not as trade but as threat. An unfamiliar word, shouted too loudly, could sound like anger. A tone misheard became insult. Spears lifted, and blood was spilled. In the silence after, the fire burned cold with the memory of violence. Language, gift of belonging, was also a border, a line that could not be crossed without risk. Yet even in conflict, influence seeped through. Warriors cried out in battle, and their enemies remembered the sound. Survivors carried those cries back to their fires, repeating them in warning, folding them into their own words. Even hostility did not stop the spread of language. Every encounter left traces, shaping sounds, bending meanings. Children were always the bridges, quick to mimic. They played with the words of others, repeating them with laughter, bending them to their own tongues. Around fires, parents watched with both amusement and unease, hearing their children echo alien sounds. Some of those echoes faded, but others stuck, becoming part of the family's own speech. In the mouths of children, new languages were born. Thus the earth filled with 1,000 voices, each distinct, each marked by place and people. yet all interwoven by contact, by memory, by the endless exchange of sound. And as humans spread farther, the chorus only grew louder, richer, more complex. Night after night, the fires burned, and with them the voices of humanity. Stories filled the darkness, traveling from elder to child, from one generation to the next. They were not written, not carved, not fixed in stone. They lived only in sound, fragile as smoke, but in their fragility lay a strange power. They could move, adapt, transform. Oral tradition became the vessel of memory. A hunter spoke of the lion he faced seasons ago, and the story carried forward, told again when his child came of age, told again when that child had children of their own. With each retelling, details shifted. The lion grew larger, the chase longer, the triumph brighter, truth bent, but meaning held. The story was no longer only about a lion, it was about courage, about survival, about the spirit of the group. This was the nature of oral culture, memory shaped not by accuracy, but by need. What mattered was not that the tale was exact, but that it was alive. Every telling was performance, every performance an act of creation. Language became art, not only tool. Myths flourished in this soil. Firelight gave birth to beings that could not be seen in the day. Spirits in rivers, voices in trees, ancestors in the stars. Words clothed the invisible, gave shape to the unknowable. Children grew up in a world where every rock and beast carried stories. To speak of them was to bind them into meaning. Yet language was fragile. A tongue lived only as long as its speakers did. When a band wandered too far and was swallowed by famine, their words vanished with them. When a war erased a clan, their dialect disappeared. When children abandoned their parents' sounds for those of their neighbors, an entire voice was silenced forever. The earth was already littered with lost languages, buried in unmarked graves, carried away like footprints in rain. Countless tongues rose and fell, their words gone before they were ever known beyond the circle of fire. For every language that survived, 100 more disappeared into silence. But this loss was not only death, it was transformation. Words did not vanish entirely, they left traces, echoes, fragments absorbed into the speech of others. A single syllable, a borrowed rhythm, a name carried forward. These were the ghosts of forgotten tongues, still whispering in the living voices of humanity. And so the chorus of languages grew, not in purity but in complexity. Speech was not a tree with separate branches, but a forest, dense and tangled, roots overlapping beneath the soil. Every voice carried history, not only of its own people, but of those it had touched, those it had absorbed, those it had lost. The fragility of language, its constant dying and rebirth, was the price of its power. Words lived in breath, and breath could never be held forever. Yet in that fleetingness lay endurance. As long as there were voices, there would be languages, each one a fragile universe, each one a world unto itself. The world now resounded with voices. From Africa to the farthest reaches of ice and forest, humanity spoke in 1,000 tongues. Each was unique, each was fragile, each was a thread in the fabric of human identity. Language had become the invisible border of every clan, the mark of every family, the pulse of every community. To live within a tongue was to live within a world. Words shaped how the river was known, how the mountain was remembered, how the animal was feared or revered. One group spoke of the same beast as enemy, another as ancestor, another as spirit. Language did not only describe reality, it constructed it. At night, the voices of the world rose like smoke. Around every fire, chants and stories unfolded, songs of mourning and joy carried into the dark. Each group's sound was different, but all were bound by the same need to remember, to belong, to endure. It was the first global chorus, though no one knew it, a polyphony stretching across the continents. Yet always, silence waited. For every voice that rose, another faded. Whole languages died in the mouths of their last speakers, leaving no trace but memory. The loss was invisible, unnoticed by those beyond the fire, yet it was constant. Humanity was already becoming a graveyard of forgotten tongues. Even as new ones blossomed, creation and destruction walked hand in hand. Still, the abundance outweighed the loss. The diversity of languages gave humanity resilience. Knowledge was stored in many forms, scattered like seeds across landscapes. If one tongue vanished,
Another carried echoes of its wisdom. If one story was lost, another survived in a different rhythm. No silence could erase all voices. Language was now more than survival, it was heritage. To teach a child to speak was to pass on identity, to carry ancestors into the present, to guarantee belonging in the future. Words became inheritance, breath became legacy, and so the tongues of the world spread, fractured, recombined, lived and died. They filled the air, filled the earth, filled the human spirit. They were fragile, fleeting, and yet unbreakable in their abundance. The age of dialects and lost languages was an age of flowering, of voices multiplied beyond counting, and though most of those voices would vanish, they had shaped the path forward. Humanity was no longer only a creature of flesh and fire, it was a creature of tongues, of countless worlds of meaning, each spoken into life by the simple act of breath.
The world was changing. For tens of thousands of years, the voices of humanity had carried everything: memory, story, law, ritual, promise. Language had been breath alone, fragile as smoke, vanishing the moment it left the mouth. But now the ground itself was shifting beneath their feet. Ice retreated, rivers swelled, herds moved, and with them humanity settled. Villages formed where there had once been only wandering. Fires no longer marked temporary camps. They burned in fixed hearths, in circles of huts, in fields, edged with the first rows of grain. The new life demanded new words. Agriculture, ritual planting, the tethering of animals, all required precision. When hunters had roamed, they needed only the cry for lion, the warning for storm, the chant of courage. But in fields, voices had to measure time, they had to count. They had to remember what was planted and where, what belonged to whom, what debts were owed, what rituals kept the soil alive. The oral world strained under the weight of permanence, so speech stretched itself to hold the new order. Words multiplied, concepts thickened, stories grew in detail. Around village fires, elders still recited myths of origin and gods of rain, but now they also recited tallies of grain, births of children, deaths of kin, debts between families. Memory was still carried in living voices, but the burden grew heavy. In every village, memory keepers rose. They were the elders who knew the songs of planting, the chants of harvest, the order of ritual. They were the ones who remembered which family had given seed to another 3 seasons ago, who had slaughtered goats for a wedding, who owed grain at the next moon. Their memories were as sacred as the fire itself. To forget was to fracture the fragile net of trust, but memory failed, voices faltered, elders died, and with them sometimes vanished debts, promises, entire chains of order. The oral world was vast, but it was fragile, and humanity was pressing against its limits. So they turned first to symbols, marks on wood, cuts in bone, scratches on stone. A line could stand for a goat, a notch for a basket of grain, a cluster for 10. The marks were crude, but they were anchors, pulling meaning down from air into matter. A scratched bone could outlast a voice. A carved tally could remain when the elder was gone. Even before true writing, the idea of permanence had entered. Knotted cords held meaning. Pebbles arranged in rows spoke of debts. Marks pressed into clay with fingers whispered of numbers. The world of language was beginning to bleed beyond the mouth, and yet around the fire the old ways still flourished. Myths grew longer, songs more elaborate, genealogies stretched into centuries, entire identities were still woven into memory. A child born into a village carried not only the name of their parents, but the weight of ancestors, recited by elders in strings of names that lasted the night. These names were more than memory, they were existence itself. To forget a name was to let a soul vanish. Thus the tension grew. On one side, the fragile beauty of the oral world, alive in breath and song. On the other, the growing hunger for permanence, for a language that did not vanish when the fire died or the elder slept. In that tension, humanity stood at the edge of invention. The first strokes of writing had not yet come, but the soil had been prepared. The seeds were planted, and soon the world of words would shift forever, from air to earth, from mouth to stone. The pressure of memory was relentless. Villages swelled, clans merged, granaries rose from earth and clay. No longer did humans live only by the rhythms of hunt and season. They now lived by cycles of planting, harvest, storage, and trade. Oral language carried these patterns, but voices strained to hold them all. Every basket of grain had to be remembered, every exchange between families preserved in song, every ritual of season recalled without error. A single slip could bring famine, debt, betrayal, so the first tools of permanence appeared. A tally scratched into bone, a pebble placed in a jar, a knot tied in a cord. None were words, not yet. They were shadows of words, placeholders of meaning that lived outside the body. A bone carved with 20 marks could whisper of 20 goats. A row of pebbles could stand for 20 measures of barley. When the elder died, the marks and pebbles remained, silent but unbroken. Clay became the great ally. From the earth beneath their feet, they pulled mud and shaped it, pressing fingers into it, letting the sun harden it into tablets. At first these tablets were crude, bearing only impressions, circles for jars, lines for grain, wedges for animals. They were not writing, but they were memory fixed in earth. They turned breath into permanence, made promises endure beyond the moment, and so humanity crossed a threshold. For the first time, language left the mouth and entered matter. The marks were not speech, but they were language embodied, voices transformed into symbols. Still, the oral world did not vanish. Elders continued their chants, myths grew longer, genealogies stretched into the past. Around fire, children listened wide-eyed as gods and ancestors filled the night. But alongside the living breath, another voice grew, the voice of marks, silent yet enduring. These marks spread quickly, across the fertile crescent, across river valleys, across the cradle of villages. Clay tokens and carved bones traveled with trade. A bundle of clay discs could mean sheep. A jar of marked pebbles could mean barley. Wherever humans carried goods, they carried symbols. Trade demanded precision, and precision demanded record. The world grew hungrier for permanence. Temples rose, gathering places where offerings of grain and goats flowed. Priests stood as keepers of memory, their duty not only to remember but to preserve. The chants of ritual were matched with tokens of clay, each sacrifice marked, each offering accounted. Religion and record grew together. To please the gods was also to please the counters. Slowly the symbols multiplied. A single mark was not enough. Combinations grew, tokens pressed alongside one another, lines joined with circles, tallies arranged into rows. Each step pulled humanity closer to the edge of true writing, though they did not yet know it. And with every mark the burden of memory shifted. No longer was everything carried in the fragile net of voices. Clay, bone, and cord shared the load. Humanity had begun to store thought outside the mind. It was a revolution quiet as dust. No spear had been lifted, no blood spilled, but the world was changing more deeply than it had in the hunt. For the first time, words were learning how to survive without breath. Rivers carved the world, and in their valleys writing was born. The Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, all of them carried not only water but memory. Where floods gave abundance, granaries rose. Where granaries rose, records multiplied. The old tokens and tallies grew insufficient. Humanity needed something greater, a system of marks that could capture not only numbers but names, deeds, prayers, and laws. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets thickened with signs. What began as simple impressions of tokens became strokes pressed with reeds. Circles and lines grew into wedges, wedges into patterns, patterns into cuneiform. Grain was still counted, sheep still tallied, but now names appeared, names of kings, names of gods, names of cities. The first archives swelled, shelves of clay holding the voices of people who no longer lived. For the first time the dead could still speak. Along the Nile, symbols flowered differently. Where Mesopotamia pressed wedges, Egypt painted pictures. Hieroglyphs rose like art upon temple walls and tombs, images alive with birds, eyes, rivers, and suns. These were not only accounts of grain and goats, but hymns to gods, myths of creation, stories of death and eternity. The Egyptian script bound religion and writing together, each reinforcing the other. To carve a name was to preserve a soul, to erase it was to kill it twice. Farther east in the valleys of the Yellow River, characters took form, marks on bone and shell, divinations etched into oracle bones, questions to the ancestors preserved in lines and strokes.
The earliest Chinese writing was born of fire and bone, a dialogue with the unseen. Even here, writing served both record and ritual. Everywhere the leap was the same. Symbols no longer only counted, they spoke. They carried sound, matched voice, preserved speech itself. They became not just reminders, but surrogates. Words could leave the mouth and still live, carried on clay, carved into stone, painted on walls. This was a revolution greater than fire. Fire had given humanity night, writing gave it eternity. For the first time, knowledge did not depend on memory alone. It could be fixed, copied, carried, stored. The words of rulers endured beyond their reigns, the chants of priests beyond their breath, the contracts of traders beyond their lives. The world was filling with voices that did not fade, yet even as writing grew, the oral world persisted. Most still could not read or carve. Fires still carried myths from elder to child. Songs still taught memory. Genealogies still stretched across generations. Writing was rare, precious, confined to temples, palaces, and archives. But its influence spread like cracks in stone. Where writing entered, permanence followed. Where permanence followed, power deepened. The invention of writing was not a single act but a slow blooming across continents, a flowering of symbols shaped by need and belief. It was humanity's second tongue, not breath, but matter, not fleeting but enduring. The world had entered a new age, though most of its people did not yet know it. Clay, stone, bone, and ink, these were no longer only tools of survival, but vessels of power. Writing, once a fragile experiment of marks and tokens, had become the keeper of kingdoms. To hold the reed, to carve the stone, was to command not only the present but the future. In Mesopotamia, scribes bent over tablets, their reeds tapping into clay, the edicts of kings and the bargains of traders. Each wedge was permanence, each sign a wall against forgetting. Laws were carved not only into memory but into matter, binding all who saw them. The spoken word could be denied, but the carved one stood unyielding. Contracts, debts, inheritances, all were etched in clay. The breath of language had become the spine of civilization. In Egypt, the walls themselves spoke. Hieroglyphs stretched across temples and tombs, recounting myths of gods and pharaohs. To carve a name was to preserve a soul. To erase it was to condemn it to oblivion. Writing was magic as much as record, the spell that made the dead eternal. Within painted halls, stories of life, judgment, and the afterworld glowed in color and stone. Those who entered felt not only awe, but the weight of permanence. Farther east, the oracle bones cracked under fire, and their marks recorded questions to the unseen. The ancestors were consulted through writing, their answers carved into shell and bone. Here too, writing was more than account. It was conversation with the divine. The stroke of a knife across bone was the stroke of eternity, joining the living with the dead. Everywhere writing carried power. It belonged not to all, but to the few, the scribes, the priests, the rulers. They were the guardians of permanence, those who could transform fleeting breath into lasting mark. With this gift came authority. To record was to decide what was remembered. To write was to shape history itself. What was carved endured, what was not vanished. Countless lives slipped into silence, while the names of kings survived for millennia. Writing was never neutral. It was a blade, a temple, a throne, and yet, beyond palaces and temples, humanity's voices still filled the air. Farmers sang in fields, mothers soothed with lullabies, hunters chanted to the rhythm of steps. Oral language remained the heartbeat of the many, while writing pulsed as the secret power of the few. But little by little, the two worlds entwined. Laws spoken became laws carved, myths chanted became myths painted, promises whispered became contracts pressed in clay. The age of stone and mouth had fused. What began as tally and token had grown into scripture and law. What began as fragile memory had become history. Humanity had crossed another threshold, one as great as fire, as great as language itself. The voices of the dead now lived beside the living, their words carved into the bones of earth. The story of humanity was no longer carried only in breath, it was etched into the world.
The age of villages was gone. Humanity now lived in cities of stone and mud brick, places where thousands of lives pressed together, bound not only by walls but by words. Writing, once the fragile tool of priests and counters, had become the backbone of empires. No king could rule, No temple could endure, no market could thrive without the mark of the written word. In Mesopotamia, cities rose from the plains, their ziggurats climbing toward the heavens. Cuneiform tablets filled archives, recording grain, silver, trade, and decree. The reed stylus struck clay like the beat of a drum, each wedge carrying the authority of ruler and god. Armies moved because orders were written. Taxes were demanded because debts were carved. Writing was no longer a tool, it was law itself. Egypt stood radiant on the banks of the Nile, its hieroglyphs carved deep into stone, painted in brilliant colors on walls that outlived their makers. To walk into a temple was to step into a forest of words, where God spoke through carved birds' eyes and suns. Pharaohs ruled not only with armies, but with inscriptions. Their names thundered louder than armies, because they were immortal, etched into monuments that the desert could not erase. Across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians carved a new path, a script of simplicity, an alphabet of signs stripped down to essence. Their traders carried it across seas, their ships trailing words as easily as goods. The alphabet spread like fire, lighting the future of Greece, of Rome, of the Western world. For the first time, writing was light enough to travel in every hand. In India, scripts flowered in the shadow of temples, carved into pillars and caves, carrying hymns to gods, laws of kings, stories of ancestors. In China, characters thickened into libraries, thousands of signs carrying philosophy, history, divination, poetry. Writing became a mirror of thought, as vast and intricate as the societies it shaped. Everywhere, writing was power. To command it was to rise above others, to rule, to shape the memory of the world. Scribes bent over tablets and scrolls, their ink and stylus giving permanence to the desires of rulers. They were both servants and masters, for while kings gave orders, it was scribes who gave them form, who made them endure. A spoken order died with the wind, a written one could travel across mountains, across centuries, and with permanence came history. For the first time, humanity began to look backward with certainty. Annals of kings, chronicles of wars, hymns of gods, all stood fixed in writing. The past was no longer only story, it was record. The voice of civilization was no longer fragile breath, but ink and stone. Empires grew on these foundations. Their armies marched not only with spears, but with tablets of law, with treaties carved in stone, with scriptures that bound the hearts of the faithful. Writing was the architecture of civilization, the invisible mortar between brick and bone. Without it, cities would crumble into chaos. With it they endured, even when their rulers fell. The age of empires had begun, and at their heart beat not only drums and armies, but the silent power of the written word. The script of empire was more than record. It was control. Armies could not be fed without lists of rations, taxes could not be collected without ledgers, temples could not thrive without inventories of offerings. Writing bound the gears of civilization together, turning chaos into order. Each sign pressed into clay, each line inked on papyrus or carved in stone, was a thread in the great machinery of power. In Mesopotamia, scribes became the hidden architects of kingship. They sat in dim rooms filled with clay tablets, copying, tallying, preserving. When rulers commanded, it was the scribes who gave the order shape, who fixed it into words that could not be denied. The king's authority lived not only in his presence, but in the lines pressed by a reed. 1,000 soldiers obeyed, not the sound of a voice, but the permanence of a tablet. In Egypt, the same was true but clothed in splendor. Hieroglyphs were carved across the walls of Karnak, Luxor, and the tombs of the Valley of Kings. Priests read them aloud, weaving religion and writing into one seamless fabric. The gods themselves were thought to speak in hieroglyphs, every sign a divine breath. To inscribe a prayer was to make it eternal. To carve a name was to preserve a soul. The dead were judged not only by deeds but by words carved into stone. Beyond these river kingdoms, the Phoenicians carried their alphabet like a flame across the sea. Where once scripts had been the domain of elites, complex and sacred, the alphabet broke them open. Traders scrawled notes on papyrus, sailors carved signs on wood. A system of letters, simple and portable, democratized the written word, and when Greece seized it, transforming signs into vowels and philosophy, the alphabet became a force that could not be contained. Greece gave birth to written philosophy, poetry, and drama. voices that survived not only through memory, but through ink. The words of Homer, once carried in song, now stood fixed on scrolls, echoing across generations. The arguments of philosophers, the laws of city-states, the speeches of leaders, all endured because writing held them. Ideas could travel farther than armies, could live longer than monuments. Rome expanded this principle to empire. Roads carried legions, but also carried scrolls of law, decrees of emperors, messages of command. The Latin script inscribed itself on stone, wood, wax and skin. To be Roman was to live under words, to obey edicts not only spoken but carved into public spaces. The empire was a vast web of language, binding distant provinces to the center not by chains but by words. In India, the scripts of Sanskrit bloomed with philosophy and hymn, carrying the verses of the Vedas, the laws of kings, the stories of epics. Words became sacred themselves, not merely tools but living powers. To speak them was ritual, to write them was permanence. On stone pillars, Ashoka's edicts proclaimed moral law to subjects across the land. In China, characters multiplied into thousands, each carrying layers of meaning. History was recorded in annals, philosophy etched into bamboo slips, poems brushed onto silk. The act of writing was an act of culture, a bridge between generations, a pillar of authority. Dynasties carried their legitimacy in written chronicles, their power inscribed into the bones of the nation. Everywhere the pattern was the same. Writing was no longer only memory, no longer only prayer. It was the skeleton of civilization. To erase it was to erase the state itself. To preserve it was to preserve eternity. The empires of this age did not speak only in the voices of kings and priests. They spoke in the carved, the painted, the inked, the pressed. Their words did not vanish with wind or breath. They endured, binding humanity into the great fabric of history. The spread of writing was never only about kings and temples. It was about the deepening of human thought itself. Once words could be preserved, they could be questioned. Once laws were carved into stone, they could be debated. Once stories were fixed on scrolls, they could be compared, copied, and transformed. Writing did not only freeze knowledge, it multiplied it. In Greece, poets and philosophers thrived in this permanence. The epics of Homer, once carried only in song, were preserved on parchment, each line fixed yet still alive. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, performed before citizens, were also written, ensuring they could live beyond the stage. Writing gave drama eternity. The questions of Socrates, the reasonings of Plato, the logic of Aristotle, all endured because the stylus followed where the voice could not. Ideas had gained immortality. Rome took this inheritance and transformed it into a tool of empire. Laws, inscribed on bronze tablets, became the backbone of governance. Treaties carved in stone enforced order across provinces. The words of Cicero thundered in the forum, but it was their written copies that gave them afterlife, studied by generations long after his voice was gone. Rome's roads carried armies, but they also carried letters, messages from emperor to general, contracts from merchant to merchant, love poems scrawled on walls. The empire lived not only in its marble and legions, but in its words. In India, the power of writing fused with the sacred. The Vedas, once oral hymns passed with perfect memory, were written, ensuring their preservation across centuries. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana, vast rivers of story, stretched across thousands of verses, too great for memory alone, yet alive in palm leaf manuscripts. Ashoka's edicts, carved into stone pillars across the subcontinent, made morality itself into writing, visible to all who passed. Writing became the conscience of empire. In China, the script became the essence of unity. Dynasties rose and fell, but the characters endured, binding diverse peoples into a shared system of signs. Bamboo slips recorded histories, silk scrolls carried philosophy, oracle bones gave way to bronze inscriptions and ink brushed across paper. To read and write was not only skill, it was power, the mark of the scholar official, the right to govern. The written word was the spine of bureaucracy, the anchor of culture. Even among peoples without vast empires, writing flickered to life. In Mesoamerica, symbols carved on monuments and painted in codices began to carry dynasties, rituals and calendars. The Mayan script, intricate and elegant,
spoke both of gods and of kings. In every corner of the world where civilizations rose dense and permanent, writing followed, carrying the voices of the living into the ages. The permanence of writing, however, came with consequence. What was written endured, what was not, vanished. Oral cultures continued to sing, chant and tell stories, but their voices were overshadowed by stone and ink. History's unrecorded faded more easily, while those written filled the libraries of future ages. Writing gave memory power, but it was also a gatekeeper, deciding what would last and what would be lost. Thus civilization was not only built on stone and bronze, but on the invisible lattice of script. The empires of this age were empires of words, each stroke and sign more enduring than armies. To conquer a people was to break their language. To preserve a state was to preserve its records. Writing had become civilization's heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing across centuries. By now, the written word had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of human life that it could no longer be separated from power. Kings might fall in battle, dynasties might crumble under invasion, but the words they carved endured, whispering across centuries. Civilization itself was not its walls or armies, but the records it left behind, the laws, prayers, stories and decrees that refused to vanish. In Mesopotamia, archives of clay grew into mountains. Tens of thousands of tablets lay stacked in palaces and temples, each one a fragment of thought preserved. Trade agreements, hymns to gods, medical recipes, astronomical charts. Civilization gathered itself into clay, and in doing so, it outlived its makers. Even when cities burned, the tablets baked hard by fire remained. Their words survived where flesh and wood did not. In Egypt, hieroglyphs marched across temple walls like armies of immortals. Pharaohs rose, ruled and died, but their names still shone in the sun, painted in colors that defied time. To stand before the pyramids or the walls of Karnak was to hear the voices of the dead calling across millennia. Their power did not fade because their words did not fade. Rome turned writing into law itself. In forums, words carved into bronze decrees declared justice, bound citizens, proclaimed rights. Roman law endured long after the empire fractured, carried forward in ink and parchment, surviving the fall of emperors. Their empire of roads and stone collapsed, but their empire of words never died. In India, the voices of sages filled palm leaf manuscripts, philosophy thick as forests, poetry vast as rivers. The written word became scripture, shaping not only politics but the soul. To copy a verse was an act of devotion. To preserve a story was to preserve truth. In China, writing bound empire tighter than armies could. Dynasties shifted like tides, but the characters endured, brushed onto bamboo, carved into bronze, copied into paper. Confucian classics trained generations of officials, turning writing into the very skeleton of government. History was not left to chance. It was recorded in vast chronicles, stretching across centuries, binding past and present together. And everywhere, writing was both blessing and weapon. To be remembered was to hold power. To be unwritten was to fade into silence. The rulers who commanded scribes secured eternity. Those who could not left only dust. Writing became the battlefield of memory, the true measure of empire. Yet the spoken word lived still, rising in markets, echoing in theaters, sung in fields. People laughed, cursed, prayed, and loved in voices that left no mark. Writing gave civilization permanence, but it never silenced the breath of the living. Together, speech and script carried humanity forward, one ephemeral, one eternal. The age of empires was the age of the word, not only the spoken word, fragile as air, but the written one, carved into the bones of the world. And though armies marched and cities burned, these words endured, carrying memory into the deep corridors of time.
When Rome fell, its walls crumbled, its legions scattered, its laws fractured into dust, but its words did not vanish. They retreated into shadows, carried by monks into stone halls far from the ruins of empire. In the quiet cloisters of monasteries, the written word survived, guarded like fire in a storm. The scriptoria were sanctuaries of memory. By the dim light of candles, robed figures bent over parchment, copying line after line, letter after letter. Their styluses scraped against vellum, their ink bled into the skin of animals stretched thin. Outside, fields lay empty, villages burned, kingdoms rose and fell. But within these chambers, words endured. Each manuscript was a fortress of thought, preserving scripture, law, philosophy, and poetry. For the monks, writing was prayer. Each letter carried weight, each word was devotion. To copy was not only to preserve knowledge, but to honor God. Sacred texts, above all the Bible, were written again and again, their words illuminating the darkness of a world often brutal and uncertain. The margins bloomed with color, gold leaf glinting in candlelight. Illuminated manuscripts shone like windows into heaven, each page a union of art and devotion. In these monasteries, language became sacred not only for its meaning, but for its survival. Oral tales faded with the generations, but the written word outlasted famine, plague, and war. The monks knew this. They labored in silence, shaping eternity one stroke at a time. Beyond scripture, fragments of the ancient world lingered. Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, voices of Rome and Greece, lived on because someone, in some forgotten scriptorium, chose to copy their words. Without these hands, the wisdom of antiquity would have vanished. Writing was not only religion, it was memory against oblivion. Yet the written word was still rare, still precious. Most of Europe lived by oral tradition, songs of warriors, tales of saints, legends of kings, carried by traveling bards. But in the scriptoria, another current flowed, slow, deliberate, eternal. The monks were gardeners of memory, planting seeds of knowledge that would bloom long after their bones turned to dust. Thus the early medieval world stood between two realms, the fleeting voice of the bard and the enduring hand of the scribe. And though the voice carried joy and passion, it was the hand that carved memory into the bones of time. In the deserts of Arabia, another fire of words was kindled, one that would spread across continents, binding empires not only with armies, but with scripture. The revelation of the Quran transformed the Arabic tongue into something more than speech. It became sacred breath, the sound of the divine itself, carried from mouth to mouth, written with reverence in ink that glowed like flame. Unlike the fragile manuscripts hidden in monasteries, the Quran was a living river of sound, memorized by thousands, recited aloud in cadence that carried both beauty and command. Yet the written word gave it permanence, turned revelation into scripture. Every stroke of Arabic script curved with elegance, every letter a vessel of holiness. Calligraphy itself became worship, art that merged the sacred and the aesthetic, making words into image and devotion at once. As Islam spread, so too did Arabic. Across deserts, through cities, along trade routes, it carried not only faith but knowledge. Libraries bloomed in Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba. Scribes filled shelves with translations of Greek philosophy, treatises on medicine, astronomy, mathematics. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad gathered the voices of many civilizations, preserving them in Arabic ink. While Europe slept in the silence of the Dark Ages, the Islamic world burned with words. In Cordoba, libraries held hundreds of thousands of volumes. Scholars debated beneath lantern light, their ink flowing as swiftly as their speech. Paper, learned from China, spread across the Islamic world, lighter than parchment, cheaper than vellum, making writing abundant. The written word no longer lived only in monasteries or palaces. It thrived in marketplaces, in schools, in homes. Arabic became the lingua franca of knowledge, its script crossing frontiers as surely as caravans crossed deserts. Sacred and scientific, it carried law and poetry, revelation and calculation. In its curves and lines, the world found both the voice of God and the language of reason. The Quran remained at the center, the axis of all writing. To copy it was devotion, to read it was prayer, to recite it was to embody the divine. Yet around it, a vast constellation of texts grew, expanding the reach of writing beyond religion into every corner of thought. Thus in the medieval centuries, writing was not only preserved, it flourished. While one world labored in cloisters, another filled libraries with light. The sacred script of Islam turned words into empire, carrying memory, lore and wonder across 3 continents. Far to the east, words found new forms, carried not only on parchment or clay, but on silk, on paper, on carved wood that could multiply them beyond measure. In India, in the forests and mountains where monks gathered, the sutras of Buddhism were copied onto palm leaves, each character pressed carefully with ink. These scriptures traveled with pilgrims and traders, carried into Central Asia, carved onto stone stelas, etched into caves lit by butter lamps. The word of the Buddha spread not by sword but by script, unrolling across the vastness of Asia. In China, the written word reached heights unseen before. Calligraphy was not only communication, it was the highest art, a meditation, a discipline of body and spirit. Each brushstroke was an echo of the soul, the balance of ink and emptiness, as meaningful as the words themselves. To write was to reveal character, to train the mind in harmony. Scholars rose not by bloodline but by mastery of the classics, their exams binding the empire together through ink and memory. Paper, born in China, gave words wings, lighter than silk, cheaper than parchment. It multiplied writing 1,000-fold. Where once texts were treasures, now they could be copied, stored, shared. Libraries swelled with scrolls, schools spread, poetry flourished. A Tang dynasty poet could carve the ache of longing or the glory of mountains into lines that would travel across centuries, each character alive with brush and ink. And then came the Great Revolution, the printing press of woodblocks. In the 9th century, entire sutras were carved onto wooden blocks, inked and pressed onto paper. The words of the Buddha, once copied by hand for years, could now be reproduced in days. Knowledge no longer depended solely on the patience of scribes. It could flow like water, fast and abundant. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE, stands as the world's oldest surviving printed book. Its words, carved in wood and inked onto paper, declared not only the teaching of the Buddha, but the permanence of human memory in new form. From China, the technique spread to Korea and Japan, where printing joined with art, creating scrolls that blended image and text, religion and poetry. In this age, Asia became a crucible of written innovation. Paper, printing, calligraphy, all merged to make words not only sacred but infinite. Thought could be copied endlessly, prayers multiplied, histories secured against oblivion. Where the West still struggled to preserve parchment, the East had already set words flowing like rivers of ink. Thus writing became not only the keeper of the sacred, but the engine of abundance. Memory was no longer fragile, it had been given the power of multiplication, the strength of infinity. In Europe, the Middle Ages stretched long, and through its centuries, the written word remained both treasure and weapon. Monks still bent over parchment, their quills scratching in silence, but now their manuscripts carried not only scripture but the seeds of a rebirth. The works of Aristotle and Plato, lost to the West, returned through Arabic translations. Ancient voices resurfaced, stitched into Latin, copied again in candlelight. The monasteries had preserved the embers, the Islamic world had fanned the flame. Now Europe was ready to ignite. The written word became battlefield and throne. Kings ruled through charters, seals pressed into wax, decrees read aloud, but validated only by ink. The Church wielded writing as its greatest instrument, binding believers with scripture, law, and doctrine. To translate the Bible into common tongues was heresy, for language itself was power. To control the script was to control the soul. Yet outside the cloisters and courts, voices still sang in the open air. Troubadours carried tales of love and war. Minstrels recited epics. Storytellers shaped legends of Arthur, Beowulf, Roland. Oral tradition still throbbed in villages and markets, alive and free. But slowly, parchment began to capture these voices too. Epics were written, poems inked, romances copied. What once belonged only to the air was bound to the page. The voice of the people began to join the voice of the sacred. And then, as the Middle Ages waned, a new revolution stirred. The press of Gutenberg, letters carved in metal, pressed in ink, could multiply words as never before. Where once a monk might spend years copying a single Bible, now dozens could be printed in months. Knowledge, once locked in monasteries and palaces, was beginning to seep outward. The age of sacred monopoly was ending. By 1500, the world of words stood transformed, from the chants of monks to the verses of poets, from the carved surahs of the Quran to the printed sutras of China, from illuminated gospels to law codes etched in stone. Language had expanded beyond voice, beyond memory, into permanence, unimagined by the ancestors who once huddled by fire in silence. It had become sacred and political, divine and human, fragile and eternal. It had been breath, then mark, then scripture, then empire, and now as presses thundered and books multiplied, it was preparing to become something larger still, a force that would democratize memory, shatter boundaries, and carry humanity into modernity. The journey that began with silence had reached a crescendo of ink and prayer, parchment and press. Humanity had carved its breath into stone, painted its soul onto walls, sung its myths into paper, multiplied its words into libraries. The age of sacred scripts was both an ending and a beginning, for with writing, humanity no longer lived only in the present, but forever in the echoes of its own voice.